Howdy folks, George here from George's Smoky Mountain RC, and today I want to introduce you to the Crack Yak 32-inch. Ordered this through Twisted Hobbies. This is a RC Factory aircraft, and they came in white, and I got a airbrush system, and I'm going to have another airbrush video that's kind of double up with a little bit of overlap in the two videos, but you can see I put a kind of a camouflage pattern on the top, kind of a red, white, and blue scheme on the bottom, and then I'm going to show you the build video, how to put this together, and then we're going to take it for a little flight and see how it does. So here's a few things that we have. We have the Crack Yak-55 32-inch, and we have the electronics pack for it, and we have all of our new airbrush system and paints. Since this is a build video, we're going to kind of bypass really quickly the painting using airbrush, and you're welcome to go take a look at the airbrush video if you're interested in that. And we're going to kind of rush through that so you can kind of see what we're doing for the paint scheme, and then we're going to be jumping right into the assembly of the aircraft. So before we can paint the top side of the aircraft, we need to first put some of these pieces together. So we're going to get out the wings, the main body of the fuselage, and the tail. Not the tail, the elevator. Which will leave these other pieces that we'll paint a little later. So we'll start out painting these. Okay, so since everything is in white, we have to be very careful to get all the right pieces in the right places, but fortunately they make it very easy for us because of the size of the tabs. So we're going to assemble this initially with the bottom side facing up, which you can tell because now here's all the big grooves that are on the bottom side. And I'm going to glue this to here, making sure to keep the aileron clear. Don't glue anything on the aileron, just the pieces between here and here on both sides. Again, these are keyed, so you've got to know where everything goes. And same thing here on the tail, on the elevator and horizontal stabilizer, because there's a little nub right here that fits into this nub. So I'm going to go ahead and glue those points real quick. Then we can start painting the top and underside of the main fuselage. So I'm using foam tack to glue these together because I know that it does not melt foam like some CEs and other things do. So now, one more thing I want to add before we do the painting is the wing spar. This is what helps strengthen the wings so they don't crack the edge here and fly off during flight. So there's a few areas that need to be cleaned out. Then this needs to be cleaned and pressed in, and I want to make sure this gets painted with everything else so we don't have a wood piece in there in our painting afterwards. Okay, so now that I have this together, at least for the main part of the flat part of the fuselage, I want to start masking it off on the bottom. Because bottom, I'm not going to do the camouflage. I'm only going to do some stripes so that it's easy to tell the bottom side from the top side. So I'm going to start masking this off, everything that I want to be white, and everything else I'm going to make red. Now for the unveiling. Hopefully it hasn't bled underneath the strips of the tape. If it has, then it's not going to look real pretty. Well, we'll see here in a second. So what do you think, folks? I really like it. That masking tape did a great job, and I think the plane came out fantastic on the bottom. So I think for the top, for doing the camouflage, I'm going to try something here to see if it works. I'm going to cut out different little designs in just some regular paper, because it works so well using the masking tape, but this won't seal the edges, so there'll be some bleed underneath, but I'm just going to give it a try and see how it works. So we have one side of the tail that's painted, and I'm going to duplicate the other on the other side. I'm going to leave this tape on because I'm going to put a little blue on the top, just like we had on the bottom, where we had blue on the two edges of the tail, on the vertical stabilizer and the elevator, and then again on the end of the ailerons. And once this is together, it's going to be kind of like this. So this is the top side of the plane. Once it's done, this will be the bottom side, and it'll look like this. So the main fuselage is done. Threw in a little bit of purple in there and a camo, and then of course our bottom has the stripes, so it's very clear when we're upside down. So now what I want to do is paint the sides and the other side of the tail. Okay, so now what we're going to do is set up the electronics before starting to add the servos and things to our plane, get everything working, and designate which one is controlling the ailerons, which there's a larger servo, and that's the one that's going to be controlling the ailerons, and the two smaller ones will be controlling the rudder and the elevator. So we want to set all this up and get our electronics working before we start tying all this into the aircraft. So we'll hook up our motor. And the motor is always supposed to turn clockwise. Normally, for a single motor setup, it's supposed to turn clockwise from the pilot's perspective. So we want to make sure from this perspective looking forward towards the motor, it actually turns counterclockwise, because it's always clockwise to the pilot's perspective. So I'm about ready to power up the electronics and bind it to my radio. So when you have these, if this is the same type of receiver that you have, some of them look slightly different than others, but they're all basically about the same size, and the pinouts along here are going to pretty much be the same. So the standard setup is going to be, the first connection is going to be bind, so I have the bind plug installed so I can bind it to my radio. Then after that you'll have a throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, gear, which we don't use here, and aux. So basically two extra channels that we're not using on this radio, which is the two open pins. And normally the lower side is going to be ground. You need to verify this with your radio, because if you reverse these you could destroy something. But normally the lower side is ground, which is depicted by either brown or black wires. The VCC is usually the center wire, which is normally red, and your top wire, which is usually one of the light colored wires, is your actual signal that controls the devices you're hooking up to, like the servos. So again, throttle is first, so the ESC has the throttle control and also provides power, has a regulator in here that supplies power to the system, which is normally going to be right around 5 volts. Some BECs can create different voltage levels, but normally it's right about 5, and sometimes 6. And this one says right on it, yep, 2 amps, 5 volts. So that throttle connection goes to the first connection. The next connection goes to the aileron, which is the larger servo. Then the rudder and elevator servos are the two smaller ones that are both the same size, which goes to the next two. So now we're going to power this up, and when I power it up, we have to go through a sequence. to enable the ESC to control the motor. So normally what you do is when you first power it up, you power it up and bind with the throttle in the full on position, and then you, once it beeps and has connected and you've bound properly, then you take the throttle full off. Then you power everything down, power everything back up, then your throttle control should work. If you don't do that and follow that sequence, then your motor will not spin. Okay, we've got the electronics all set up, and we're going to get ready to bind to the radio. And I've got bind plug installed. So the very first thing I'm going to do is push the throttle up all the way to the maximum position. Then I'm going to get the radio ready to bind. And just before I bind on the radio, I'm going to plug in power and hit continue to bind. Notice the lights flashing saying we're in a bind mode, and I just went out of bind mode. Let's see. Okay, bind, yes, and bind. Okay, as soon as binding is complete, take your throttle all the way down low, unpower your system, make sure to pull your bind plug back off or you'll have to repeat the process. So what I just did with the throttle is calibrate the ESC to my radio. So now the motor should work. So now if I plug this back in, wait for the beeps. Okay, the beeps are finished. Now if I apply throttle, I should get engine movement. And I do. Now, notice the direction of the motor. That's kind of hard to tell. All right, so that does appear to be turning clockwise. So it's going the wrong direction. So I'm going to swap two of these pins on the motor. And now we should go counterclockwise. And we're moving counterclockwise. Okay, which again is going to be clockwise from the pilot's direction. Okay, so our electronics are now set up so I can start centering the servos and preparing the servo arms prior to starting to put this together with the servos into the fuselage. So I've done a dry fit of the servos just to see where everything's going prior to putting the rest of the fuselage together and setting the servos up. So there's one servo that sits near the top of the aircraft right here, and this is going to control the rudder. There's one that lays flat just forward of it here, and that one is going to control the elevator back here. And then the one in the front, which sits right here and comes off in the bottom, this is going to control both of the ailerons. And when you're done, make sure that all the wires for all the electronics, pick a side. I'll probably pick this side. Pick a side, make sure all your electronics goes to that same side, because that's where we're going to hook up the receiver and the ESC that then controls the motor. So now I'm going to start setting up. I'm going to center, since I have the electronics set up, center the servos and set up the control arms. So the elevator is going to sit this way, and the control arm is going to come straight up and run all the way down to the elevator. So we want it with it centered, and it now should be centered. So it's now centered. So I want this to go straight up and down. So I'm going to center this as best as I can. It's probably right about there. So that is the elevator. Okay. So now we want to put the nut in that holds this in place, and I want to use a little bit of Loctite. I usually use the blue Loctite, which can be broken loose again. And I usually put a dab of it on a piece of cardboard, And then just kind of put just a little bit on the tip of the screw. And then apply that to hold the servo arm. So again, this is the elevator. Okay, don't over snug them too tight because you don't want to strip them out. All right, so that takes care of the elevator. It's going to sit like so. And then the rudder is going to sit straight up and down. This is going to sit here. The elevator will sit, elevator control will sit right here. You can see there's a little notch also where the wire should be going in the foam. This is going to sit here. Now the elevator control is on this side of the aircraft. So what I need to do is make sure this arm is centered coming off in this direction. Find the closest spline to get as centered as best as possible. It's never going to be perfect, but it's always perfect on one side. When you're going off the other side, it's always off by like one little thread or one little notch. Okay, so now that hammer's on, I can go ahead and tighten that screw up as well. Add my Loctite. So for the aileron servo, the control horn, there's a piece. When it first pick this arm out of the bag of parts for the larger servo, then you need to find this piece in the bag of parts that came with the aircraft. You'll see one side looks kind of rough, a little 3D printed looking. That's the side that you want to glue to because it's nice and rough and will hold the glue better. And we're going to use a little bit of thin CA, and we want to center this on the arm, center these together so that the distance from here to here on both sides is the same. And then go ahead and glue that with some thin CA. So the larger servo has 3 different screws in the box. One for holding the servo arm on the servo, and then has 2 of these self-tapping screws. And what the directions are saying for this plane is now we want to take the self-tapping screws, now that this has been CA'd onto, CA'd together, put this screw near the end on one of the 2 outer holes. I think I'm going to do the second from the end on both sides. And before I do this, I'm not going to just try to self-tap it because it'll make a mess. I'm going to pick a drill bit that's just under the size of the screw and then just kind of hand drill out the 2 holes. And then once these are screwed in, they need to be either ground down or cut off or filed down so that the extra weight is then removed. All right, so I have my screws in, and what I did is I just took it to a bench grinder and just ground these down flat underneath. So now we are ready to center this on the servo. So for that, I need to power the electronics back up and make sure the servo is thoroughly centered before I tighten down and lock tight the screw. Okay, so this should now be centered. So when this attaches to the servo, it's going to attach in this direction. So the piece that bends away on each side of the servo control horn or control arm needs to point basically away from the wood brace. So you want to sit this direction. You do not want it sitting this way. You want it sitting this way. So the next thing I want to do, and I want to get this done before we start gluing things together because it's really hard to do it later, is the little pieces that hold in the connecting rods for the push-pull rods hooked to the servo horns. These little tiny pieces need to be inserted. Make sure that all your glue is dry. This one's not 100%, so let me go to these first. So in every case, this gets applied pointing away on the side, away from the servo. So I'm going to put this in the furthest one out because I want the most control throw. Now, once you do get it on, you want to make sure that it stays loose, loose enough to turn, but not too loose. So you want to just press it on just enough. And just a little bit more here. Okay, that's on. There's a lot of play in these. Okay, so now I just have to do this 3 more times. So I've got them all on. Just make sure they do turn freely. See kind of what that looks like. Same for the elevator and the rudder. They're painful to put on, but just a little bit of patience. Hardest part of the build for me, just getting these little tiny little tabs on. Before I start gluing the top and bottom fuselage pieces on and securing some of the servos that we've prepared, I want to go ahead and glue the canopy onto the top. I'm going to use foam tack for this. This stuff works really great for this purpose. So now what we're going to do is install the elevator servo, and I'm going to have all my wires come. This is the bottom side of the aircraft. You can see that the hinge cutout is right here. This is the bottom side of the aircraft, and the elevator servo, which I already installed the arm, is going to sit down in here like this. And I'm going to keep all the wires on this side for all the servos, because all the electronics are going to sit on the underside of the aircraft on this side. So I'm going to set this on this edge of the table here. Take this all the way down so it's nice and flat with the arm sticking down the other side. And I'm going to hold this side down with some 1, 2, 3 blocks. Okay, so I'm just going to use a little bit of foam tack. And it's nice when you use foam tack because if you have to get the servo out for repair in the future, the foam tack can be taken loose a little easier than like CA, because it's a little more rubbery. It gives a little more, and it hopefully would not have to tear up any of the foam to get this out later. It doesn't take a lot, just a little bit. So now we're ready to glue on the bottom fuselage piece, but I need to make sure that this servo, which is going to basically sit down in this hole, properly mates with the cutout right here. So what I'm going to do is just put a tiny little bit of foam tack on there first, and then I'll finish gluing the rest of the servo in from the other side later. But I want to make sure also that my wire stays up and over on this side where my electronics are going to be. So I put just a little foam tack where that servo is going to sit for this side. And then I'm going to put glue all along this bottom fuselage piece. No need to do the pieces that go through because there's nothing on the other side for them to catch right now. So just the bottom surfaces, not the pieces that stick out. So while the glue is drying for the fuselage piece here, I'm going to go ahead and separate the two aileron control horns and start glue the one on this side that's on the table first, and I'll glue the other one later. So first thing you have to do is break these apart and then clean up the edges. And then what you want to do is run a little knife, X-Acto knife, through the slot itself. It's already pre-cut, but it's not necessarily clean. So you want to run this through there and make sure it's very clean. No pieces of foam sticking between there. And then I want to go ahead and do a temporary fit. And the very edge, the inside bottom edge, should line up right with the edge of the slot. Don't let it go too far forward, or when the elevator is pulled in, it won't go all the way up. So it should be able to go all the way up to where it touches. Then once you have it where you want it, you can either use CA glue or foam tack to hold it in place. I think I'm going to use foam tack. You also have the option to use epoxy if you'd like to use epoxy for it. So again, you want to get it right up to the edge. And just double check that it can fold all the way up. So it looks good right where it's at. So the next thing I'm going to do is to prepare the one end of each one of the aileron push rods by affixing one of these little mounts. So basically what's going to happen is I'm going to use some epoxy and epoxy these in so it sits kind of like right in this little groove, and there's a small piece of heat shrink that will go over that while it's curing to help hold it in place. So one thing that I'm going to do, well, first separate two of these. Later we're going to do the same thing to the elevator and the rudder push rods as well. But normally I would use like some denatured alcohol or something like that to clean these surfaces before trying to mate them, or some other type of rubbing alcohol, something that will evaporate but clean them really well and clean off any fingerprints. But I found another neat little trick. Just open up one of these alcohol wipes. They sell these. You can use these for cleaning just like eyeglasses or safety glasses, and just use these because this evaporates away. Just don't touch the end that you've cleaned once you've cleaned it. Got to act fast because this evaporates really quick. Same thing with these little rods, but this saves a little bit of time. These are basically just safety wear lens cleaners. So there we go. They're clean and ready to glue. So now I'll get the epoxy ready. Okay, so I'm just going to use just a small amount of epoxy. It doesn't take a lot. Just going to put it right on the edge. Just on the edge of this, and hang it off the table, and let that start curing a little bit. Now you could use 15-minute epoxy, 5-minute epoxy. I'm using 30-minute epoxy. I've seen it. It seems like it has the best bond. So I'm going to let this sit. I'm just going to let it cure for a little while before I continue on. Right, so it's had a little time to set up. Not very long. But a good 5-10 minutes to give it a chance to not be quite as liquidy. And make sure not to get any of the epoxy into the tip where it's going to attach to the linkage. Okay, so when you bring the heat shrink up and put this into the heat shrink, and then just work it down. There we go. It's kind of a pain to get in there in the beginning, but just get it in there enough. About right about there is probably good. Now they say shrink the heat shrink. And could use a heat gun or just a quick little trick. Don't do this very long, you don't want to melt the plastic. Just hit it just enough. Don't want to melt anything. And it actually worked out really well. Just a few moments is all it needs to shrink. So while my glue was wet, I decided to go ahead and do the other push rods as well. So they're all glued, heat shrinked, and drying. And this is what, so the two longer ones are the thinner ones that are going to go to the elevator and the rudder, and the two shorter ones, of course, are the ones for our ailerons. And once this is dry, we can go ahead and start attaching the ones for the ailerons to the control horn. My epoxy. So what we're going to do, slide these inside here on each side. And then I'm going to put the little screws loosely in here that are used for torquing down on the push rod to hold it in place once we're set. All right. Okay, so what I did is I placed some tape, some masking tape on the ailerons on both sides. And then I have my wood underneath and some 1, 2, 3 blocks on top just to keep the ailerons as straight as possible. Got the system powered up and the aileron servo is centered. So then I plug these in from the outside. Push rods, both from the outside, just kind of snap in very gently. And then tighten down the screw. Tighten it down to where it's snug and then maybe about half a turn. Don't go too much because you don't want to crush the carbon fiber rod. Next, I need to trim the carbon fiber rod. There's multiple ways that you can trim it. Some people will use like a Dremel with a cutting wheel, or you could just go ahead and snip them off. If you snip them, it's going to crush it a little bit. So make sure you have it a good distance away, and then when you're finished, put a dab of CA on it to help it from splintering. So now I'm going to glue in the support piece. There should be 2 of these, one for each side. These go on the bottom side of the aircraft. And it should, this front hole should be a little bit past the wooden spar. And it should sit in here at a 45-degree angle. So it should go all the way down to the elevator, but not all the way to the hinge. And you want to make it the same on both sides. We're not going to do the other side yet because we have the electronics to deal with. But we can go ahead and use the foam tack or whatever glue you want to use for this to glue the support piece in, which I'm going to do now. Got some 1, 2, 3 blocks on the back side to keep this nice and level, 90-degree vertical from the base here to make sure this stays as vertical as possible this way. Okay, so before we can put the other one of the black strips on the other side, I need to get their electronics situated. So I've just temporarily turned the plane over and I'm going to glue in with foam tack the rudder servo. And you can tell in the rudder servo it's going to go this direction because the rudder is going to be controlled going down this surface. And the foam has a little notch right here where basically where the wire is going to sit, and this is going to sit flush down in here. Make sure the wire is run through to the same side as the wires, the rest of your wiring for the electronics. So I'm going to put just a little bit of glue around there. It doesn't take a whole lot to secure the servo. Just plug that down in flush. Okay, so what I'm going to do is the servo wire from the front here for our aileron servo, I'm going to kind of tack that in with some foam tack to bring it back a little bit. And I'm going to fold these wires in and hook them up to the receiver. And then I'm going to glue this in and bring it most of the way up so that I can tuck the wires in once it's dry. And then we'll get this set up just on the outside of this with everything hooked up. So we'll see how this comes together. So we got the first part of this already glued on and dry. Now I'm going to run the rest of the wires, tuck them all down inside here, and I'm going to have the receiver sit right about here, kind of midway on this control rod, sit right here. But then all these wires are coming from inside, so what I'm going to do is cut a notch in this, about halfway up, for those wires to come back out. So about halfway. Then I can tuck the wires in and glue the rest of this piece. So we've got this whole strip glued on now. And you can see I cut the little slot, so all the wires are tucked inside here and coming out the little slot here. And I used a piece of double stick that came with the receiver to put the receiver down against the material. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one side of the antenna and I'm going to tack it down with a little bit of cement, not on the metal, exposed metal part, but on the black part of the wire, a little bit of foam tack to hold it here. And I'm going to take the other one straight out this way along the spar and tack it down as well. Don't put anything on the stripped part, just put it on the coated part, and just a little bit to hold it in place. And then the underside of the electronics is done for now. Later on we'll take the ESC, and the ESC will go somewhere around here once the motor's on, and then run the wires for the ESC and throttle control. So for the next step, we're going to go ahead and glue on the upper fuselage. To do that, again, going to use a little bit of foam tack. Might want to do a dry fit first, just to make sure everything fits really snug, and see if anything needs any trimming, which I've already done. So while I'm waiting for the foam tack to dry, I'm going to go ahead and use some epoxy. Now you can use pretty much whatever you want here. You could use some CA or you could use some foam tack, but I want to use epoxy to hold on the engine mount because I want to make sure it's going to be nice and steady and not go pulling off. Alright, so the mount is glued on with epoxy and I'm using some large push pins, these big guys. One in each mount hole to kind of hold it tight while it's drying, so I can get a very nice bond. You don't want to wipe off the excess behind because you want to let that dry really solid and give extra support, but you do want to kind of wipe off the front slightly because you don't want any unevenness when you go to mount the motor, and also make sure that this hole here in the center is open going back. So I had a little extra epoxy left over from gluing on the engine mount, so I figured, well, since I have some epoxy and waiting on the engine mount to dry anyway, go ahead and use that to put on the control horn for both the elevator and for the rudder, which of course is going to sit right here. So one other thing about this build, I'm not going to install the landing gear. I learned from a Edge 540 build, very similar type build, that the landing gear really more inhibited me from flying in certain areas than helping me. And without the landing gear, you can pretty much land on any surface. Now, if you want to know how the landing gear goes together, you might want to subscribe to our channel and check out the Twisted Edge 540 build, because I do go through all the steps for installing the landing gear on the same type of aircraft, just slightly different model. But it basically goes together the same way. But I'm not going to install it on this model. Folks at the airfield said, yeah, you're not going to like the landing gear, and they were, sure enough, they're right. You can launch this just by throwing it with your hand, or just kind of let it lift off and go on its own, and then you can land it on any surface pretty much. So definitely is better without the landing gear. So now that the glue is dry, this connection seems really solid. So I think I'm going to skip putting the blend term tape on. Usually you put the blend term tape, you just take the tape and you kind of tape it over the edges and use some CE to glue it down. But I think I'm going to, just for future builds, I want to see how sturdy this is and how well this engine mount will hold up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bolt the engine on with the wires going down to this corner, because my electronics are over here on this side. So I'm going to mount the ESC somewhere around here and bring the wire for the throttle up and through to the receiver. So when looking at the hardware that comes in the packet for the motor, you notice there's some little rubber bands. These are what's used to hold on the propeller, which works really well and helps you from breaking propellers. It has these little collets, which normally are not used, and I will not be using them for this build. And it has the 4 screws to screw the motor on. So I'm going to use a little bit of foam tack to glue down the ESC and the wires coming from the motor. Keep in mind, I already checked my direction to make sure that it was correct for the engine motor, so I don't have to swap the wires around. Now, with the ESC glued down, I'm going to take my battery cable, battery connector, and bring it up just past where the servo sits up here on the top, because the battery is going to sit somewhere right in this area. But I don't know exactly where the battery is going to be until I balance out the aircraft. But I'm going to go ahead and run the wire through, and it should have enough length to route it to the battery as needed. So what I'm going to do is just going to cut a small slot in the foam. Okay, so now the ESC is all done and glued in. I'm going to glue on the rudder next, and I've got the plane kind of sitting on the edge of a table, weighted down with some 1, 2, 3 blocks to hold it in place, and that'll help me get a nice even edge for lining up the rudder. So I can line it up at the bottom, line it up at the top, and then get everything just right. Then once I glue it, I'm going to use some of these little push pins to kind of hold it in place. I'll let that dry for a little bit, then I'm going to have to move the plane at some point, because I don't want it to glue down to the table with any glue that squeezes through on the bottom. So let's get gluing this thing. And so now that the tail is dry, I'm going to put a small piece of Blenderm tape right on the seam here, and then also on the seam down here. And I'm going to do that on both sides, just a small piece, because I want the seam to be reinforced. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is get out the little mounts for the push rods, and we want to trim these apart with an X-Acto knife. Just trim off the bottoms, and do this for both. One half is for one push rod, the other half is for the other push rod, so you just need to cut all these out. Do not glue these into the airframe just yet, because these need to be inserted onto the push rods first before we do that. All right, so these are not glued in, but I have all the push rod mounts sitting in the holes that are already they were already there in the foam when you get them from the factory. These are not glued in because we want to run the push rod all the way down through and through the mount on the elevator horn. Then we'll snap the back end. Once everything's in place and we have the angle just right for all of the mounts, then we can glue the mounts. And I'm going to use some foam tack. Now you could use any other type of glue that you want, CA or epoxy or anything like that, but I'm just going to stick with the foam tack. It works well for these. So now that I have everything aligned, and I inserted the push rod from the inside, because it lines up a little better from the inside of the control horn. And then now that I have that in place, I can start gluing down all the little posts. Don't tighten the, don't tighten up the elevator horn part of the push rod until after these are all dry. Okay, so I've duplicated the process for the rudder, and that's snapped in from the top going down the control linkage. And of course, make sure not to get any glue into the eyelets, and glue down, once I put the control rod through, glue down all the individual guides. And then over here is through the servo. Now this side for the rudder nor the elevator have been bolted down yet, or tightened down, because I need to hook up the electronics again to the battery and make sure the servos are centered before tightening them down. Once we do that, then all the control linkages will be finished. So I'm going to take this opportunity before putting the bolting down the control linkages and cut out the vortex generators, and they will glue on the smaller one here, and the larger one glues in here. So you got to cut out the little square in here, and I'm just going to use some of the same glue I've been using, the foam tack, to glue these in. So I have all the vortex generators installed on both sides now. See underneath. And there's a tail hook that, in the directions they say to put in the tail area, on the tail section right under here, where the rudder meets the fuselage. But since I'm not putting on the landing gear, I'm not going to put that on, because I'm afraid that that would just help the prop to dig in, or this to dig in as I'm taking off. So I'm not going to install that. So the only thing left is I'm going to hook up the electronics, center the servos so I can tighten up the screws and trim the two control linkages for the elevator and the rudder. Then the only thing left after that is to do the balancing, which requires the prop. Do the balancing so we can cut the slot where I'm going to insert the battery. Then after that, the only thing left would be setting up the radio, and the plane is ready. So I got my power to the system, and notice I have some tape on the elevator to hold it in place, hold it in center. Same thing with the rudder. And now my electronics should be centered with the radio on. Okay, so that means I can go ahead and tighten up the control linkages with everything centered. Okay, so the control linkages are all tight, and I put a tiny dab of CA where I trimmed off the end of the rods, the push-pull rods here. Notice there's also a little extra push-pull rod for adjustment, but I put a tiny bit of CA in the end just to stop the carbon fiber from splintering. So I'm getting ready to measure the CG of the aircraft to figure out exactly where I'm going to cut the battery slot, but the propeller has to be installed first. So you install the propeller with a shorter piece here near the back, and the larger piece here in the front. That's where the rubber band's going to go over. And there's no collet needed. They have a different setup. They show the directions for a different motor, and the collet doesn't fit this. So you just put it on with no collet at all. You just plug this right on the front. And then what I like to use is just a little screwdriver with a bit out of it, and I can use that just to pull the rubber band up and around. But they do have a special tool you can get for doing this. Okay, rubber band is on. Okay, so 18 center. The CG on this is 180 millimeters, which is 18 centimeters from the tip, from the very tip of the nose here. So I've got that set on my balancing machine, and I'm going to set my battery in here. I usually fold the wire back, so I want to set the battery on here and see where my center of gravity will be. All right, so it looks like it's right about here. So just forward of the servo. So I'm going to draw a little line around my battery is and cut a slot, and then we'll be ready to set up the radio to fly. Okay, so one last walk around the airplane. Everything completed. Got the notch out for the battery. There's all the electronics. So for the starting rates for my first flight, I've got the aileron at 160 for the high rates, rate and expo 63 and 50 for medium, and low rates, which will be, of course, when I do the maiden flight, 30 and 32, and it's pretty much similar to that for the rudder and elevator as well. You'll have to adjust it relative to your radio to your likings, but we are now ready to fly. So, welcome to the first flight test. We're going to be in the air in just a minute. Got my headgear ready for recording, and we're ready to go. So you can probably see from our flight videos there was quite a bit of wind, and this aircraft actually did really well for the amount of wind. I mean, this thing was flying in, you know, between 10 to 12 knot winds, and I was able to control it pretty good. I wasn't able to trim everything out because the wind was just too heavy, but I really like this plane. I'm planning on flying this a lot here in the near future, and definitely enjoyed the build. I think you definitely will like building and flying this aircraft. So if you liked I hope you liked the video, and if you did, maybe check out our channel and subscribe if you'd like to see some of our other build videos. We have some larger planes coming. I've got a P-38, very large P-38 coming with 3 retractable wheels, and then we have a Extreme Flight 64-inch MX2 coming your way. It's a balsa plane, and that one's going to be very, very exciting. So check us out. It's kind of funny because I was told the outline where I just previously put the painting on the back of the plane looked like a kind of looked like one of those outlines in a crime scene. This is where the plane fell down.